Hi everyone, I'm Charles Strait, Appian's Director of User Experience. When I talk to Appian developers, I often remind them that usability isn't just skin deep, that caring about user experience isn't the same thing as just making things look pretty. You may have seen this pyramid before. After satisfying your minimum functional requirements, great applications need to target efficiency to let users save time as they do their work. Apps also need to be intuitive to allow new users to get up to speed with minimal training. But we also can't forget that we're building apps for people. People make decisions and form preferences through emotion, not just rational analysis. Whether it's a handcrafted luxury bag, or a collector car, or the home they live in, people don't decide if they like a product just based on its capabilities and value. Beauty is as expected as functionality, and that's why the topic of this talk matters to all of us. How do you make an Appian app beautiful? I'm going to share some of our top tips today. The list of recommendations is quite long, so if you remember only one thing, when designing visually appealing UIs, the best thing you can do is to learn by being inspired by the best. The world's most admired software companies have tested their designs on millions of users. Of course, I'm not talking about actually copying their code or graphics, but getting your ideas from top designers is nothing to be ashamed of. Unless you're a professional designer yourself, you shouldn't be trying to reinvent the wheel. Stick with familiar patterns that your users already know and already like. Your organization, or the ones that you're developing apps for, already have established guidelines for how they want to represent their brands, so always start with those. That keeps Appian consistent with the other applications and leverages the work that their designers have already put into developing a cohesive theme. Okay, but you don't just want me to tell you to copy, so let's talk about some specific areas of visual design and a set of tips that you can keep in mind as you design. Let's start with the subject of color. There's nothing wrong with wanting more appealing designs, but it's very easy to cross over from tasteful to garish. How do you know when you've gone too far? In general, it's best to stick to a very small color palette of a few colors for each app. If you look at the best known digital brands, they often choose to communicate their identity with very few colors. A huge diversity of tints doesn't say colorful in a positive way, it just tends to look messy and a bit amateurish. Most organizations have defined brand palettes, and you should always use these colors where possible. Colors can be used to make parts of a screen stand out, but this should be done relatively rarely. On this page, we do want the alerts to stand out, so we chose colors that don't blend in with the rest of the theme. But on a page like this, the random colors aren't meaningful and they just distract from the rest of the content. That's not to say that there should never be a variety of colors on your page. When color diversity is represented within the content, that tends to work just fine. On this page, a set of colorful flag icons represent the countries that are part of this product launch. Because the viewer can clearly tell what they represent, the effect isn't distracting. Likewise, on this page, the structure of the content is obvious, so a very different icon for each industry on this page doesn't make it particularly harder for the viewer to understand what's going on. Appian allows you to put boxes with colored backgrounds almost anywhere on the page, but what's the right way to use them? Whether you use a card layout, a billboard, or an image, it's easy to add rectangles of color in your UI. Used without sufficient care, it's a common way to end up with disruptive eyesores on a page. When is a color box not appropriate? A clear sign is when it feels too heavy on a page and pulls the user's eyes unintentionally away from equally important content elsewhere in the interface. A design like this one, which uses different color boxes throughout, comes off as dated and heavy-handed. When you start paying attention to well-designed UIs, you'll see that they don't necessarily avoid use of heavy boxes with color backgrounds, but these tend to be anchored to the top and bottom of pages as headers and footers. Instead of distracting and unbalancing a UI, these header and footer boxes actually serve to anchor the rest of the content on the page. Here's an Appian example that uses a dark colored card as the header of the page. The prominence of the card works because it's clearly the identifying title of the page and is not a random distraction. Starting with the 20.1 Appian release, this type of layout has become even more effective because you can choose the header content layout for your page to show a flush header with no margin around it. Similarly, you can set a color or photo as the background of a flush header on your record view UIs. This lets you add a prominent decorative header to the records where that choice makes sense. Images are another important part of visually appealing UIs. The first tip is to think of providing proper frames for all of your photographs. Here we see how unpolished a UI can look if photos are allowed to float unbounded. They look randomly placed instead of being intentionally displayed. The avatar style should always be used when showing users' photos. The style guarantees a consistent size and shape frame around each photo. It's like a gallery of aligned frames instead of a bunch of mismatched prints that are stuck randomly on a wall. Non-user photos should be allowed to fill their containers edge to edge. This is also to give the impression that they're part of an intentionally arranged display. When a photo doesn't have a strong contrasting background, use the thumbnail style to provide a frame so the image doesn't look like it's floating in space. While photographs should be displayed as if they're in rectangular or circular frames, logos, icons, and illustrations have distinct edges to their shapes, and those don't need to be framed. Finally, be careful about using photos in place of icons. Icons are simple shapes, often with a single color, that help users to identify controls without adding a lot of clutter to the UI. When photos are used for the same purpose, they tend to distract because users end up looking at the details of the image and may have a hard time quickly identifying the concept that's represented. Business applications tend to rely more heavily on words than on images. That's why using different font features to emphasize information on a page is a valuable tool. When you look at a dense interface like this, you can see that the uniform text style makes it hard to scan the page for information. Everything on the page looks like it's of similar importance. Varying the prominence of certain text makes that information jump out. At a glance, we can tell that the name of the student is the title of the record that we're looking at. For very recognizable information like GPAs, the numeric value is more important than the explanatory label, and the font style conveys this relative difference. The most obvious font feature that can be configured is size. But don't forget about weight, color, and capitalization as other tools for text differentiation. On this page, we want to show a clear hierarchy consisting of the page title, a section title, and subsection titles. We use a variety of font sizes, colors, and capitalization to make each heading very distinct. We now move on to balance, which may seem to be a more subjective topic than the previous ones. But there are still handy tips that you can try to follow, such as thinking about ways to go beyond default left alignment of content. Since left alignment for left to right languages like English is the standard behavior, you see a lot of UIs that have all of their content shifted to the left of each section. This is a wasted opportunity to better use screen space and to make the page feel more balanced. For example, the cards on this pharmacovigilance dashboard use all corners to show information, instead of crowding everything to the left, which leaves space unused and also makes it hard to read cramped content. We can give each attribute its own dedicated space. If we look at the cards on the right, each card represents a report of an adverse drug reaction. Moving clockwise from top left of each card, you first see the age and gender of the patient, then their location, how long ago the report was made, and finally the list of symptoms on each card. The separation makes good use of the space and makes it easy to scan for the different parts of information. When there's just one message or piece of information inside a container, horizontally centering the content often makes it feel most balanced. This also works on a larger scale when you're trying to fill a lot of space with a concise message. The rules for visual balance aren't always simple, so be on the lookout for any spacing that looks awkward, and then you can try different things to improve the layout. Here, one prominent piece of content looks awkward because it's floating in the middle of the billboard overlay. In this other example, there's just a lot of undesirable white space because contents haven't been carefully sized or arranged. This design shows several different techniques for establishing harmonious balance. Let's zoom into each of them. The two main groups of content within the colored header card are horizontally opposed. The picture and the name, they're left aligned, and the other key attributes are right aligned. The result is that there is an obvious blank space left on the right edge of the card. The attributes on the right half of the header are packed together, each taking up only as much space as needed. This prevents awkward spacing where equal width is assigned to each field, but the values are all very different in length. We accomplish this by using a side-by-side layout. While the default behavior of this layout is to keep the same amount of space horizontally to each item, it's easy to configure a different allocation when that makes sense. In this case, we want the photo and each of the fields on the right to take up only as much space as they need. So we set the widths to minimize, and then we set the student's name to a width of auto so it takes up the remainder of available space. Finally, in the center column of the page, we make the free GPA values look consistent and balanced by centering the text and using an evenly distributed side-by-side layout. While white space is sometimes a side effect of inattentive design, it can also be used as a tool to make pages look balanced. This page has very little content, and it's all at the top, which makes the rest of the page look conspicuously empty. This is a better way to handle empty states. By centering content horizontally and vertically, leaving white space around it, it looks like an intentional design and not just a rushed implementation that failed to fill the page. White space balance within each element is also important. Here the cards have a lot of horizontal white space, but vertically the contents feel a bit cramped. A design like this gives appropriate breathing room that's proportional to the content and to the page. The fundamental problem with a lot of UIs that don't look great is clutter. And a very common cause is overuse of nested containers. If you look at the My Messages section on this page, each post is a card inside a box layout inside another card. Along with the general overuse of cards in this interface, the user perceives a lot of clutter and finds it difficult to parse information. The wrapper card around these navigation cards on this page makes it harder to tell which tab is selected and also adds clutter to the page. A simple unnested representation like this may work better, especially if it resembles common navigation controls that the user may already be familiar with from other applications. Another big culprit is overuse of billboards. In this example, there's no apparent benefit to using a shaded overlay on top of a gray color billboard background. It just creates even more color bars on the page to distract users. The clutter of billboard backgrounds often makes simple content unnecessarily hard to read, like on this page. So you should always ask yourself if your UI really needs the addition of a decorative photo. Oftentimes, the subtle visual elements like icons on the page can make the page look appealing without adding the clutter of an unimportant photo. When you really think that the page is too simple without a photo, consider using a short, full-width image field instead of a full-fledged billboard with an overlay. This allows the photograph to serve as more of an accent instead of distracting from the content. Speaking of billboard overlays, the overlay transparency, of course, matters. New in 20.1 are two additional options to allow you to better control the contrast between your background and overlay contents. These intermediate choices are alternatives to the existing dark and light styles. Remember the tips that we just went over for creating visually appealing Appian UIs. Make sure that you're looking at the proper use of tasteful colors, showing images in the best way, picking appropriate typography to convey the structure of your content, thinking about visual balance on your pages, and avoiding unnecessary clutter. Even if you can't remember all of these rules and suggestions, a useful habit is a subjective gut check. Ask yourself, does this design look like it reflects your organization's brand? Is it clean? Is it professional? Is it contemporary? Let's conclude with a quick walkthrough of an example UI showing some of our design tips in action. This is our design for an employee onboarding dashboard. When a new hire accepts an employment offer, that kicks off a series of tasks across different departments. IT has to order their computer, HR has to set up their benefits, and so forth. This UI allows a manager to keep track of the progress of onboarding tasks to make sure that everything goes smoothly. Since this UI is fundamentally showing a long list of read-only data values, we could have built a screen like this, but it's not very appealing, nor would it be very easy to scan. Instead, we chose an approach that divided the data into multiple groupings and gave each section a different visual treatment. We wanted the page to have a clear focal point, so we used the header content layout, new in Appian 20.1, to place a flush header bar at the top of the page. This section clearly identifies the new employee that we're looking at and allows a viewer to quickly see important attributes. We made the header look balanced by vertically centering the content and justifying the two groups of items to the left and right edges. For the information on the right, we use icons and a larger font size to emphasize the data values. Moving to the next section, we use a gauge component to show a prominent summary of onboarding task progress. On the right, a timeline makes it easy to see the main steps of the new hire journey, key dates, and durations of phases. The timeline is constructed using a side-by-side layout and rich text items, but it's easy to get started with such designs by using our pre-built patterns in the interface designer. Just drag an item from the Patterns tab of the palette onto the canvas and modify it as needed. Here we're using the thicker style progress bar alongside rich text labels to show an easy-to-read comparison of department progress. The stack of bars facilitates comparison across data values. Finally, let's look at how we can use a list of people to show who is in charge of this new employee's onboarding. Again, we're using a pre-built pattern available in the interface designer to show a user photo next to the person's name and title. Look at how the text is vertically aligned within the photos. We also use different colors, weights, and capitalization to differentiate employee names and titles effectively. What's next? Check out the latest UI features in Appian 20.1. You'll find a summary of them in the release notes on our documentation site. And keep an eye out for the 20.2 release, which will be available soon. Also on the documentation site is our UX design guide, which is always being updated with our latest best practice recommendations. Finally, check out our growing list of patterns, templates, and examples in the Interface Designer that show you our recommendations for how to compose typical UI elements using the latest platform capabilities. If you don't have Appian yet, just visit this URL or scan this QR code to register for a free trial. Thank you for taking the time today to learn about how to design great-looking UIs for your Appian users.